Most companies just take last year's budget, tweak a few numbers here and there, and then call it a day. But what if that is actually eating into your profits without even anyone realizing it? When you rely on last year's numbers, you could be paying for projects that aren't relevant anymore, departments that are bigger than they need to be, or expenses no one even is questioning. That's exactly where zero based budgeting comes in. In this video, I'll break down how zero based budgeting makes you justify every single dollar. So you're not just cutting costs, but building a budget that actually fits your needs for today. Zero based budgeting is also one of the favorite topics in the FP&A interviews. In fact, interviewers like to ask about zero based budgeting in different ways. So let me walk you through some of the common variations you might hear in the FP&A interviews. Can you explain the concept of zero based budgeting and how it differs from traditional budgets? In what scenarios would you recommend using zero based budgeting? What are the biggest challenges companies face while implementing zero based budgeting? How can FP&A teams support successful zero based budgeting process? Can you give me an example of how zero based budgeting improved cost efficiency in your past experience? How would you explain zero based budgeting to a non finance stakeholder? What tools or softwares can help streamline zero based budgeting process? How does zero based budgeting align with companies strategic planning? What are some of the common mistakes companies make while implementing zero based budgeting? How would you convince leadership to adopt zero based budgeting if they are used to traditional budgets? Now, before we get into what zero based budgeting actually is, let's take a quick step back and understand where did this whole idea come from and why do companies even today keep going back to it. Zero based budgeting actually goes all the way back to the 1970s. It was introduced by a guy named Peter Pyre who was working at Texas Instruments back then. The idea came from a really simple but powerful question: why do we just assume that every single expense from last year automatically deserves a spot in the next year's budget? At that time, the companies were struggling with rising costs and a lot of economic uncertainty. So ZBB started gaining traction to cut down unnecessary spending and focus on what truly adds value. However, then in the 1980s and 1990s, zero based budgeting kind of faded into the background as most companies felt it was just too much work, especially without the kind of technology we had back in the day to handle all the data and number crunching that ZBB requires. However, in the 2010s, zero based budgeting made a huge comeback, largely thanks to a company named 3G Capital. When they took over Kraft Heinz, they went all in on zero based budgeting and used it aggressively to cut costs. This time, though, they combined it with modern tools and software, which made the whole process much faster and more data driven. Even today, zero based budgeting is still popular, especially with companies going through cost cutting phases, mergers, or just who are trying to run a tighter ship. It is not perfect, and we'll talk about the pros and cons of zero based budgeting soon in the next few minutes. Now that we have looked at how zero based budgeting has evolved over the years, next let's break down what zero based budgeting actually is and how it is so different from the traditional budgeting processes most companies are so used to. So here is the big idea behind zero based budgeting. Every budget starts completely from scratch. Let me repeat that. Every budget starts completely from scratch. Unlike the usual budgeting process where you just take last year's numbers and add a bit here, cut a bit there, and then call it a day, zero based budgeting flips that. With ZBB, every single expense has to justify itself, whether it's a big project or something as small as a software subscription. Every team has to explain why they need that money and how it directly supports the company's goal. If they can't make a strong case, that spending might not make into the budget at all, even if it has been there for years. The whole point is to make sure that every dollar actually adds value instead of just rolling over the expenses out of habit. It's definitely more work upfront, but it also forces teams to think critically about how they spend instead of just saying, well, that's how we have always done it. Now, to we understand how zero based budgeting works in practical life, let's talk about four key principles that make it different from traditional budgeting. First, no automatic carryovers. Just because something was in the budget last year doesn't mean that it gets a free pass this year. Every single expense has to re-earn its place. Second, everything is tied to business goals. It is not just about cutting costs for the sake of it. Expenses need to directly support the company's strategy or deliver real value. Third, ZBB breaks spending into activities or decision packages. So instead of just saying marketing gets 10 crore rupees, you break it down. How much for digital ads? How much for events? How much for research? And each piece has to stand on its own. Finally, prioritization is key. Once all the activities are listed and justified, they are ranked by how much value they deliver, and the budget is built from top down, funding the most valuable activities first. These principles make zero based budgeting a lot more intentional and value focused. That is why so many companies use it when they are trying to tighten up spending or shift their strategy. Now, I am sure some of you might be wondering, how does zero based budgeting actually compare to the traditional budgeting processes that most companies follow? Let us break this down. With traditional budgets, you basically start with the last year's number, adjust a few numbers here and there based on expected changes, maybe sales growth, inflation, or new projects, and that's it. The problem here, a lot of old expenses just gets carried forward automatically, even if they are no longer necessary and adding much value. With zero based budgeting, it's the complete opposite. Every expense, whether it's $1 or $1 million, has to justify itself from scratch. There is no automatic carryover, and every department explain why they need each cost and how it supports the company goals. So traditional budgeting is much faster and easier, but it is also less flexible, and it tends to bake in inefficiencies over time. On the other side, zero based budgeting is more work upfront, but it helps companies cut costs, focus on priorities, and align spending with strategy, especially when every dollar counts. In reality, a lot of companies use hybrid approach where they might apply ZBB in certain areas like travel or marketing while keeping a traditional budget approach for more stable and predictable costs. One question I am often asked is, why do companies go through all this effort with zero based budgeting? Let's talk about some of the biggest benefits of ZBB. Number one, it forces cost discipline. Every dollar has to prove that it deserves to be there, which naturally cuts out waste and forces teams to think smarter about spending. Number two, it challenges the status quo. With traditional budgets, a lot of expenses just roll over year after year without anyone questioning if they are still useful. ZBB forces those conversations and helps uncover spending that's no longer relevant. Number three, it makes sure spending and strategy actually match. Every expense has to tie back to business goals, which helps companies focus their budgets on what really matters instead of spending money anywhere and everywhere. Finally, it improves cost transparency. Because you break down everything into individual activities or decision packages, the leadership gets a much clearer view of where the money is going and whether it's worth it or not. Overall, zero based budgeting helps companies spend their resources smarter and not just spend less, which is why it is such a powerful tool, especially for FP&A teams. And of course, zero based budgeting isn't perfect, and it's definitely not for everyone. Let's talk about some of the biggest challenges and criticisms companies face when they try to implement zero based budgeting. First, zero based budgeting is time consuming. Compared to just tweaking last year's numbers, ZBB takes a lot more effort because every single expense has to be justified from scratch. That can slow down the whole budgeting process. Number two, it requires deep process knowledge. To justify costs properly, teams need to really understand their own processes and value drivers. And in some companies, that level of detail isn't just there. Number three, face a lot of pushback. People are used to getting a set budget every year, so when you suddenly ask them to fight for every dollar, it can feel demotivating. Finally, it can get too focused on short term savings. If companies aren't careful, zero based budgeting can cut too deep, slashing budgets for innovation, long term projects, or brand building efforts, all just to hit short term cost targets. So while ZBB is a powerful tool, it needs the right mindset and balance. At FP&A Professionals Institute, our mission is to help 1 million finance professionals master finance and FP&A skills. We offer comprehensive FP&A and finance learning programs for all levels. Visit our website www.fpnaprofessionals.com to learn more and kickstart your FP&A journey today. Here is a quick look at the pros and cons of zero based budgeting. If a company really wants to make zero based budgeting work and not just turn into a painful cost cutting drill, there are a few best practices that can make a huge difference. First, and the most important, get the leadership buy in upfront. ZBB isn't something FP&A can push alone. You need top management fully on board because it's a cultural shift. Second, clear communication is everything. Teams need to understand that ZBB isn't just about cutting costs, it's about aligning spending with strategy. If people think that it's just a cost cutting exercise, you will face a lot more resistance. Number three, using the right tools. Modern budgeting tools and FP&A software can make ZBB a lot easier by helping you track, justify, and rank expenses, especially if you're doing this across a very large organization. Fourth, focus on value, not just the cost. The goal isn't to cut for the sake of cutting, it's to make sure every dollar is driving value. Sometimes that also means spending more on high impact areas while trimming the low value stuff. Finally, combine ZBB with performance metrics if you're clear on how each activity ties to the business goals and KPIs. It's much easier to justify right spending and make sure you're investing in what really moves the needle. Done right, ZBB isn't about tightening the belt. It's a tool that helps you to focus on your budget and on what matters the most. Also, zero based budgeting isn't just a theoretical concept. Many big companies have used it in real life, and some of them with pretty interesting results. One of the most famous examples of ZBB is Kraft Heinz after it was acquired by 3G Capital. Now, 3G Capital is known for its aggressive cost cutting strategies, and they used ZBB to strip out billions of dollars in expenses. Everything from travel budgets to office snacks had to be justified from scratch. Another great example of zero based budgeting is with Unilever. They also used ZBB, but they took a more balanced approach. Instead of just slashing costs, they used zero based budgeting to free up money for innovation, marketing, and sustainability projects, proving that ZBB isn't just about cutting costs, it can also fund growth if done right. Many other companies, especially in FMCG, manufacturing, and even tech, have tried zero based budgeting, especially when they are going through a merger restructuring or a cost optimization phase. The key takeaway, zero based budgeting works best when it's not just a cost cutting tool, but a way to realign spending with strategy. Now, you might be wondering, where does FP&A fit into all of this? In a zero based budgeting process, FP&A isn't just number crunching in the background. We are actually at the center stage making it work. First, FP&A teams design the templates and frameworks that the business teams use to justify their expenses. We help them break down costs into decision packages, track them, and tie them back to the strategic goals and KPIs. Second, we act as facilitators. FP&A often runs workshops with different teams to help them understand how to justify their costs, how to identify value drivers, and make sure that they are not just requesting funds out of habit. Third, FP&A helps leadership prioritize. Once all those justifications are in, FP&A works with the leadership to rank activities by value, model different scenarios, and build the final budget based on what delivers the most impact and not just what fits the last year's template. Finally, FP&A tracks the results. ZBB does not stop once the budget is approved. FP&A teams play a key role in monitoring actuals versus plan, making sure that the expected value is actually delivered, and also identify new opportunities to optimize spending throughout the year. In short, zero based budgeting is a budgeting method, but FP&A is the engine that makes it actually work. I am curious to know, does your company still use traditional budgets, or have you experimented with zero based budgeting or any other methods of budgeting? Let me know in the comments below. I would love to know how it is working for you. And if you would like to understand the FP&A budget cycle in detail, please check a detailed webinar on this topic. And to download free resources on FP&A interview prep, check the links in the description. Also, if you would like me to cover any of the FP&A interview questions, put them in the comments below and I'll make a video on it. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.